All right. Hey, everyone. My name's James Sanders. Welcome, everybody, to the Coffee Chats about AI podcast. Today, I'm talking with another James Horine. Welcome, James.
Hi, James. Thanks for having me here.
All right, good stuff. Hey, so James and I were talking the other day about different career paths in data science and machine learning, and James started dropping some pearls of wisdom about the individual contributor path and the manager path. And I sort of said, right, okay, let's do, this is great stuff. Lots of other people in AI can probably benefit from this, I bet. So why don't we do a podcast about it? So here we are. So James, and we're calling it sort of, I'm thinking about coffee chats about AI. So just so you guys know what I'm drinking in my coffee here, I'm using these new espresso pods. So just trying them out. They're pretty good. So I'll be sipping on that while we chat. And James, maybe you can also, while you introduce yourself, could you tell us a bit about what you're drinking as well?
Yeah, so today is the let's see, Trader Joe's organic Earl Grey tea, but it's usually Blue Bottle's 17-foot ceiling. So that's what I prefer to drink. But today I was kind of on a bit of a time crunch with lunch, so it's Earl Grey for this afternoon.
All right, thanks. So give us a quick intro about yourself and your background.
Yeah, certainly. And again, thanks for having me here. I really appreciate it. Like quick background about myself. Like I didn't think of myself ever as a data scientist, and sort of the identity around kind of what I am has evolved a lot over time. But when I got started with my pursuit in mathematics, I was a pretty big underperformer in high school, which I admit is probably farther back than you want it to go.
Oh, good.
Um,
No, that's hope for us all. That's
there,
excellent.
there, there is hope for so many people. I mean, honestly, right? Like the aside is that mathematics education in the US is really tough, and I don't have the answer about how to make it better. But I wish that I could help at some point. But like being an underperformer in high school, I thought, well, what am I going to do? I'll just go be a lifeguard. So I was a tower lifeguard in Solana Beach, California for a couple of years, and that's was kind of my universe. That's all I thought that I was. And fast forward a couple of a few years and a few degrees and some learning and a lot of reflection. And now I sort of state my background as like I'm a statistician, and more importantly, I think of myself as a problem solver. And specifically, I have graduate training in statistics with a focus in non-parametric classification of high frequency time series. So I do some nerdy stuff too.
Yeah, right, cool. So just to sort of round out our picture of you a little bit as well, are there a couple of personal projects that you're sort of particularly proud of, perhaps?
Yeah, there's a couple, and I'll touch on, I guess, sort of like one personal, one professional that I that was more recent that I'm really fond of. Professionally, I was leading a disease modeling data science team for a couple of years within Bayer at Climate, and I had the extreme privilege of leading a team of just absolute geniuses towards the development of some really slick environmental weather characterizations, and that feature engineering, led to this dramatic improvement of disease models that we used for commercial crops. And I never thought I would have been working on that stuff.
Wow,
Now,
that's
you know,
amazing. That's really cool.
it was so cool. I mean, if you were to go back in time and say, James, back when I was like Jimmy, like a little kid, like James, you're going to work on disease models at massive global scale, I would have been like, who, like, why are you talking? That's weird. Why would you say that? That's just a strange thing to say to someone. And I loved it. I absolutely love it. It was one of the things that I'm really proud of in my career. And thinking about like outside projects too, I got connected with a professor at FSU and another friend that I ended up working with out of California. And what we had noticed was that there was a lack of sort of, or what I have seen so far. I don't want to say this as like a grand statement because I'm one person. I can only see so far. But what I've noticed is there seems to be a lack of frameworks to do modern agronomic data science. And I thought, well, what if we lower the bar, or what if we lower the barriers to doing agronomic data science because a lot of people come into the industry without being data scientists or software engineers or mathematicians, so on and so forth. So let's build a library that can, that is fast, is easy to use, is super transparent, and I call it tidy agronomy. So I built a package to try and solve for lowering the barriers to doing agronomic data science at scale. And it's, a couple of lines of code. People can contribute to it all they want to. And I'm looking for contributors if anyone's looking. And at the end of the day, what it does is it's still, right, it lowers that barrier of doing the data science work. And from what I can tell is nothing else is faster than it so far.
Right. So what we'll do is we'll include a link to that project in the notes so people can go and check it out and contribute if they feel like it. That's
I'd absolutely love that.
yeah.
Yeah, I could use the help. There's so many things to do.
Right, right. Okay. So all right. So what is it that you actually do on a day-to-day basis? What are you doing?
I admit that I generally try to avoid this question at parties and gatherings, James, but I like to try and focus on what I do for fun, as I think that's far more interesting. But I admit that, we became connected in professional circles on LinkedIn, so I won't dodge the question a second time. So what do I do for a job? I work as a data scientist, and my career has been pretty wide and varied, and data science is the most applicable term for what I do today. To maybe answer that earlier question, I think of myself as a problem solver. And I tend to get called in when we want to deploy sort of a generalist or a sort of a broad set of experiences. So that's, myself, uh, uh, you know, as someone who wants to, who loves getting technical on a difficult and extremely ambiguous problem. So like, what do I do? Data science. Like, how do I, sort of like, how do I apply it? And it's more of I'm a generalist now at this point in my career. And I love getting technical and trying to solve these kinds of problems. And usually, again, I get that call when it's like, we don't really know which direction we're going to go in, or it's complicated and it's tough. Like, can you help sort through this? And I always say yes, because I've kind of got no fear about those things.
Yeah. Great. Sorry about the phone, guys. Very big mistake. I left my phone on. But so why is it that you find the distinction between what you do for work and other pursuits as important? What's important to you about that?
Um, so, a couple of years ago, I noticed that I had always been, thinking about like myself and my identity was really tied up in work. And that just led to a very specific kind of like life path. And at some point a couple of years ago, that stopped, resonating as true and important and authentic for a lot of the things that I want to do. And I had again the extreme good fortune that a friend of mine and trusted advisor sent me a book to read called A Good Enough Job, and it helped me reframe and reprioritize. And it did sort of two things for me. It made me care actually more about the work that I'm doing and that I want it to be impactful. And then it also made me realize that, there is so much more to life than just the thing we do for money, for compensation, right? There are a lot of things we do, and I try to do as many of those things as I have time and energy for, or coffee for in some cases.
Yeah. Right, right. So what are some of those things that you like to focus on outside of work?
So there's a couple. I might have a lot of energy for a lot of things. For instance, I played saxophone for 20 years, and I stepped away from that a couple of years ago. I was a swimmer in college, and I still compete in open water extreme distance swims to this day. In fact, this morning we just finished a registration for a 5 kilometer swim here in Chicago, and some friends are encouraging me slash bullying me via text message to join them in a 25 kilometer swim. And I'm thinking that's a lot, everyone, but like maybe we'll see, right? August is a ways away. Like it's not a problem to think about today. Um, I was also a sign language interpreter for a couple of years, and I studied for 8 years. And now today I also find myself like hopelessly hooked on grassroots motorsports. And
Right.
oh, I one of the other things that I do a lot of and I take extremely seriously is I cook. And I love cooking with and for friends. And when we think about that, it's like, well, what do you do? Is it just blue box mac and cheese? No, we're talking like
Yeah.
we're gonna braise 20 pounds of meat for starting yesterday. We're gonna make tortillas from scratch. We're gonna serve 20 people. Call all your friends. By the way, it's a themed party. Bring your wig, put something funny on, and like show up as the theme, please.
Yeah, I'm
So we
coming
do,
over. I'll be there shortly.
yeah. Just let me know when you're in Chicago. We'll try and set up something small. We'll limit it to like 30 people.
Yeah, great. So what about sort of career wise? You've worked at some startup, smaller type places. Obviously Bayer is pretty, very, very big player. So what's your experience been across the different sort of sized organizations?
Varied. It's I've been at this point now in my career, I've been, like an IC, a manager. I've bounced back and forth between a manager and an IC a number of times. And the one thing that I keep coming back to is I keep coming back to try and solve interesting problems.
Yeah, yeah, no, that makes sense. So, but that gets us sort of onto what prompted us to sort of get this podcast up and going was sort of the individual contributor path, the manager path, and how sometimes your career progression goes through sort of alternating between those things. Some people only want to do one and not the other. But as you said, you've sort of bounced back and forth between those. So what are your thoughts on how to manage that?
For how to manage that, I would then have to answer the question at some point, like, what is it that I want to do? And I haven't figured that part out still. Like, I still see myself as that beach lifeguard years ago that's kind of going, I'm not sure what the day is going to hold. I don't know. Um, how I manage that, thinking about that more strategically today, I'm seeking impact in the work that I do, right? Like that's the part that I get really excited about. As far as managing that kind of not dilemma but that experience, like being a manager can mean one thing in many organizations, and being an IC or an individual contributor can mean one thing in many different organizations, and sometimes they can mean almost the same thing, which is also very fun. And I've found a couple of really fun places to do very impactful work where the strict definition of what a manager or an IC is kind of like so close together you can't really tell them apart sometimes. And I think those are also very fun places to be.
Yeah, yeah. So I know that you've one of the things you mentioned about was the sort of risk of getting stuck in a sort of a glass ceiling situation where you feel like you can't progress. So what are some of those differences between the manager and the IC from sort of organization to organization?
Yeah, certainly. I think about that when we were chatting a little bit last time too. I remember very clearly that day when another senior manager that sat across from me at a company said, you would want to take a step back. And I was thinking to myself, taking a step back, I want to be like an equivalently recognized IC because of just the way I try and do work and the way I can influence. It's not a step back. It's probably a step like into the thing that I'm really good at. But their perception of wanting to step back, wanting to do something that wasn't the same was a step down. And I thought that's such an unusual forgive me, not unusual. That is such an interesting perception for someone to have. And I thought like that was sort of at that time when I thought, wait a second, is my identity like this thing or is it something else? What is it that I'm good at? So back to the earlier question, like what are the differences? And that can really vary greatly. And it depends sort of on the organization that we're in. Some organizations and companies, in my opinion, do a very good job at rewarding and recognizing people who want to explore either pathway at about in the same way, right? When that comes with like promotions, influence, responsibilities, accountability, compensation. I often think of it as sort of like the four Ps: people, problems, pay, and purpose. And, often companies that in my opinion that truly understand the influence of very senior ICs and very senior managers and leaders will tend to lockstep that recognition and reward. Other companies are not as good, and that's okay, right? I'm not a pro at identifying those companies, and I will not answer any questions as to who is and who isn't. But what I can say is that it is worth people's time trying to figure out or ask and inquire, is the place that you're in now, is that going to reward and recognize either of these paths about the same? And then, I think on top of that, expanding a bit more too with the idea of like glass ceiling, there are a lot of places that will simply say like, this is all we have in this kind of career arc, and we don't acknowledge any more. And I think that's a darn shame sometimes because, digital technology and a lot of the tools that data scientists and software engineers use as part of their day job, that is transforming what the way we do work today. Excuse me. And I had the privilege of being on a call a few days ago with some colleagues internally, and I got to watch their faces light up as they realized, for instance, the way new generative AI technologies were going to enable them to do new and different things. And watching their faces light up was kind of this like, aha, like they see it now as well. So, when it comes to that again, back to that glass ceiling idea, it's like, does it exist? Maybe. It depends a lot on the organization. But still, I think again, it's sort of this like darn shame when companies don't or are unable to recognize and reward that kind of that talent. Because again, right, like the way we're going to be doing work in the next, 5 to 10 years is going to fundamentally shift because of technologies that we're adopting today.
Yeah, yeah, and I think we might even touch a bit more on that a bit later on too. So I think there's a lot of heartburn that certain people come across in those different roles, and they're probably different depending upon which track you happen to be on at the time. So, what sort of heartburn have you seen from both sides of the fence?
Certainly. As an individual contributor, I've seen job expectations change like on time scales that don't make a lot of sense sometimes. And when I mean time scales that don't make sense, I mean like on a week by week basis. And that can be really, really challenging as an IC that is, mid-career, is hungry, is trying to understand the very things they're doing and, contribute at a very, very, very high level. And that can be really discouraging at times too, right? Like when the goalposts that you're working towards are changing or you're not even aware of them. And that's kind of one of those like I see it a lot of times with data scientists who are kind of this like 1 to 3 or 4 years in their field. And whenever I speak to them, they often have a lot of frustration. And I try to ask questions like, what's right? Like what's wrong? Like, like have coffee with me. Like I want to understand the problem. And it usually comes down to this idea that, the goalposts, the measurement, the sort of the evaluations of the work they do is either not as clear or is really it could even be as far as like mathematically impossible, which I've seen a couple of times, and that's a really uncomfortable place to be if you're a first year or second year data scientist. Like you're like a baby, right?
Yeah,
You're like, oh my
yeah,
gosh, how is this possible? Um, all right, and that can be one source of frustration as an IC. Another could be, it does leadership understand, what it is they're asking sometimes, and that's also a really tough one. Really, really technically sharp leadership is going to ask questions around, how do we get to impact? And finding leaders that are like that is definitely it's worth everyone's time to think about how to get to. On the other side, the being a manager, one example that of on the job of heartburn that sticks out to me was a couple of years back, I stepped into a new role and inherited part of a team, and I was new to them, they were new to me, and I was was many things, but I was very far from perfect. I'm still very far from good, I would argue. And I was given direction to write a fairly critical evaluation of someone. And James, it was like
Oh,
it made me sick. Like I went home ill that day. I like color drained from my face, not like I was unwell.
yeah,
And I didn't know
so
details
unfair.
about this person. Like I didn't know the partner's name. I had no idea. Right. And I had to write an extremely critical set of evaluations of someone who to this day I still believe is candidly smarter and better spoken than myself. And
Yeah.
it gave me this like pit, this reminder that there are some things I don't want to have to do ever again because they're really uncomfortable.
Yeah, yeah, no, that sounds really unfair. Like that position that you were put in was terrible. But I suppose I mean, what did you learn from that, or how, how has that shaped you?
I got really fortunate that the first number of times I managed people, I had detected the people around me either, like bless all of them, they either saw me struggling or they had a lot of empathy. And I like thank you all. Thank you all for putting up with a very junior version of myself. Um, and I took those experiences to heart and I worked really hard on understanding how I can lead people better today than I did back then. And I made this switch in my mind that people are not liabilities as things I can't control. Right, people are really these wonderfully inventive and creative assets. And if I want to lead, it's very much part of my job to figure out the ways and communication styles and questions to guide them, not direct them, but to guide them. Similarly, I had to learn that there was a big difference between something as simple as asking, because asking often comes up as asking to challenge, which is very different than asking to learn and understand. And I admit also at the same time, I'm a touch bombastic or tempestuous, as one of my close friends calls me, and she's very brilliant. And she called me that once, and I thought, that's correct. I am a little tempestuous at times. But similarly in wrapping up that question, like I've begun to use my own, or I used to view my traits or my personalities as liabilities, and I said, screw it. Like those are superpowers now.
Yeah, yeah, it's one of those things that comes up a lot in HR sort of surveys and everything is, hey, am I able to bring my full self? Can I share my full self in the workplace? You know what I mean? So
Yep.
it's great that you've been able to recognize that those things about you are your superpowers. So that's fantastic. So what can it mean then to sort of to be a manager, and what can it mean to be an IC? What are maybe some things that people may not think about when they're considering these different roles?
Certainly. It's easy to think about maybe some traits that help delineate the two. And I used to
Yeah,
think that, yes, managers have to have really, high EQ, to manage. And I'm finding out more and more that a senior lead, right? I'm not using the word IC or manager, just a senior lead. Their ability to influence is their superpower. And that has become in my opinion, a delineation between effective and not as effective. And again, I'm being very careful in how to dodge the question just enough
mm,
that I tend to see ICs as people that want to work on problems and understand like the technical depth of problems, and managers are possibly trying to think about how to enable and inspire and connect various people and technologies together as well. Um, as an example, now I spend a lot of my time thinking about how do I craft my message as an inquiry for understanding. And I'm not sure if that's the role or the trait of a manager or an IC, but it's a trait of a lead, in my opinion. Um, and I try to craft that very carefully, and I try to make sure that I'm not just issuing an outright demand or decree of people. But I admit, like, I'm human. There are days where my coffee is not good, or I've messed up making my coffee, and I really try to keep those short-sightednesses out of the conversation. But again, right, like, traits that delineate managers and ICs, I think that it's more around the way people want to do, or they want to leverage their ability to influence. And I do very firmly believe that at the end of the day, senior leads, and again, I'm intentionally avoiding calling them ICs or managers,
Right.
they have to be able to leverage their ability to influence, and they have to leverage their sort of emotional intelligence at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. So that sounds like a very time-consuming, effective, but a very time-consuming, approach. So that sounds like you must have extremely full days.
Yeah, I try to I'm again I'm very fortunate. The work that I get to do is very, very interesting and very intellectually engaging. So I think of like myself as being busy as a feature, not a bug. And I think of that as being a feature of being a problem solver, right? I don't sort of see myself as someone who, or I see myself as someone who's not really an IC and not really a manager, and I spend a lot of energy managing, but I also spend a lot of energy on IC things. And, like, yes, busy, and I have to do things like put calendar holds for lunch and laundry, otherwise I'll forget.
Yeah. 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 No, I can relate to that. My wife laughs when she looks at my calendar and the things that I have to put on there. Just sort of taking a bit of a step back, and out of the sort of the now, and let's look forward a little bit. How do you think the data science, machine learning job is going to change over the next few years?
I mean, if I had a crystal ball, right, I'd be reading that right about now. But I've seen a couple of very interesting trends start to perhaps strengthen in the past couple of months to maybe the past year. Um, One that I see as being here is the idea of generative AI. And I admit that I'm not a generative AI expert. I use the tools a lot to do a variety of, excuse me, to do a variety of tasks. I use, some of the open source stuff to do things like write workouts for myself because that's super easy.
Yeah.
But Gen AI is here. It's very loud and it can do a lot of really cool things. This retrieval augmented generation is a wonderful tool for so many different kinds of tasks. Um, Additionally, this idea of data fluency beyond a digital mindset, and I think this one is big. I see so many folks that really understand the concept, but they might not be as strong at thinking about the problem or problem space they're in terms of data. And everyone that I'm thinking about, in my mind right now, they're all smarter than me. They're a lot smarter than me. And I spend time looking at ways to enable them to become more data fluent. And that's, how do we go beyond the idea of let's use Excel? And I think about that as like I want to help them get into we have a properly versioned database with valuable data assets, and here is the summarization structure that leads you to insights. I think those are the kinds of things that as technology is changing rapidly in front of us, if more people are on board with thinking about this idea of data fluency, right? They can really see that like that data structure and data set in their head. I think that's gonna really supercharge and change the way we do work in the future.
Yeah, well, appreciate that. Let's James, thanks again. Let's wrap it up there. James, thanks for joining me and sharing your hard-earned wisdom today. It was really fun to catch up. And thanks everyone for joining us on the Coffee Chats about AI podcast. And we will see you all next time.
Thanks so much.